So it's Athens time, and there'll inevitably be some people who come in, but let's get started. So can you hear me now? Yes. Yeah, thank you. Good. So thanks for coming out to tonight's event. It's brought to you by the Menard Family George Washington Forum. For those of you who haven't been to a forum event before, it's a civic education initiative which aims not just to promote viewpoint diversity here at OU, but also to provide a forum where sometimes contentious subjects can be discussed and debated in a reasonable way. Tonight's events, like all GWF events, is made possible not by public funds or student fees, but by the generous donations of OU alumni and by grants from private foundations. And I want to particularly thank the Menard family for making tonight's event possible. So in August of 2019, the New York Times launched the 1619 Project. It was meant to coincide with the 400th anniversary of the first slave's arrival in colonial Virginia. And the project aimed, in its own words, to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contribution of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. A 100-page special edition of the Times magazine featured essays which argued, among other things, that our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true. Elsewhere in the edition, we learned that modern capitalism built on the norms and practices of chattel slavery. The project offered a kind of unified field theory which explained anything and everything in American history. So I think it's fair to say that the 1619 Project's reception among journalists, public intellectuals, and educators has been rapturous. Nicole Hannah-Jones won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary for her essay. The Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting created online lesson plans to be used in K-12 classrooms. And earlier this month, Random House published the 1619 Project, a new origin story, which expands the project's original essays into a book. Among our modern Lumiere, the 1619 Project seems to hold a kind of scriptural authority. It might not all be literally true, but it nonetheless lays bare the original sin which forever taints the nation. Its arguments aren't scholarly holdings which are subject to criticism, but metaphysical truths. Against the backdrop of applause, though, can be heard some insistent voices of some professional historians and political scientists who've raised doubts about the project's various claims. And one of the most insistent critics of the 1619 Project's claims has been tonight's guest, Professor Lucas Morel. His is a sober, scholarly, but dissentient voice, just the sort of voice this forum tries to bring to campus. So Lucas Morel is the John K. Boardman Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University. He's the author of multiple books, including Lincoln and the American Founding and Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in America's Self-Government. He's editor or co-editor of Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, of Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, a political companion to the Invisible Man, and of The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. He's the former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War, a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and he currently serves on the U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America, a founding it dates to 1776, not to 1619. So I hope you'll join with me in welcoming Professor Morel here to Ohio University.
Thank you, Professor Ingram and the Menard Family George Washington Forum here at Ohio University for this invitation to speak about the 1619 Project and what I call a missed opportunity. The lead essay, written by Nicole Hannah-Jones, reinterprets American history in light of the Black American contribution to its development. But I believe she ultimately falls short in presenting an accurate account of the triumphs and travails of the United States by emphasizing the contributions of Black people at the expense of white people. The 1619 Project teaches Americans today to view their history as a zero-sum game instead of the integrated, borrowed glory, struggle, the integrated struggle for freedom that it actually was. In doing so, the 1619 Project founder, Nicole Hannah-Jones, makes the nation's progress in securing rights for Black Americans, I believe, harder to understand and therefore more difficult to discern any lessons that could help address modern problems of social and political strife involving race. In addition, I believe that she undermines the trust that Americans of all races need to resolve political differences peacefully and thereby perpetuate their self-governing way of life. It's been 2+ years since the publication of the 1619 Project, as was mentioned earlier. Since that time, of course, it's been introduced to a lot of high schools. She garnered the Pulitzer Prize for commentary, journalism commentary, and she's now collaborating with Oprah Winfrey on related film and television projects. This month, Penguin Random House published 2 books, one of them a children's book, that expand on the project theme. In short, the 1619 Project is undeniably an American cultural phenomenon. And I believe because it deserves scrutiny because of its claims about what she considers the true founding of America and the legacy of Black American slavery. She and the New York Times have since walked back the claim of our true founding, as they originally called it, which was the 1619 year, which was the basic premise of the project, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I want to explain why I think her essay had the potential to advance our understanding of our past, but it stumbled on a number of important fronts. In short, her essay was not only deficient in its understanding of both the American founding and my area of expertise, Abraham Lincoln, but it was also politically divisive in its presentation of American history as heroic Black virtue triumphing over pervasive white vice. A project that aimed to give Americans a better perspective on their past failed to do so in an accurate and fair-minded way, and I believe likely contributed to greater polarization of our civic life. Her essay for the project is really an essay about visibility. It's about how we see America's founding, how we see Black Americans, their role in this country's development. It's ultimately about how we see each other, both as fellow citizens and as human beings. Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man, he called this, quote, moral perception, the perception of the wholeness of American life and the cost of its successes and its failures. By wholeness, Ellison meant that despite many decades of enslavement and segregation of Black people on American soil, Americans across the color line were far more connected than they realized. He thought the influences went in both directions, even before discriminatory barriers were removed. Hannah-Jones looked only at one side of that connection, the Black American side. She ignored a majority white America that did not act simply as one gigantic monster of white supremacy throughout its history. Without a good number of white Americans sympathizing with the political plight of Black Americans, I don't think very much progress in securing civil rights for Black Americans would have been made. Her mistake, what makes her interpretation of American history so bad, was to present that history as if the recovered strivings of Black folk had to displace the recorded achievements of white folk, especially those we have long been taught to view as iconic representatives of the American way. What was needed was a more comprehensive revision of American history. We do need to highlight the courageous participation and patriotism of Black Americans, but we must also be honest about the challenges, the obstacles the American founders faced in trying to establish a free society in a land, yes, long accustomed to racial slavery, and appreciate the national crisis Lincoln faced when he tried to get white Americans to re-adopt, as he put it, the Declaration of Independence as the moral compass of their political practice. Without Lincoln, the United States was headed towards the nationalization of slavery. We take for granted Lincoln's successes, both politically and militarily, while lamenting his failures, both real and perceived. Instead, riddled with half-truths, overstatements, out-of-context quotations, and errors of both fact and interpretation about the founding and Lincoln, Hannah Jones's history distorts our past and actually works at cross purposes with her argument that it was Black Americans who fought to make our ideals true. If you skip the table of contents in the New York Times Magazine issue that was devoted to the 1619 Project, where the lead essay in the table of contents is titled "The Idea of America," and it's called simply "Democracy" in the book that just came out. If you skip the table of contents and just went straight to her article, if you begin reading her 73-word essay, you find in letters at the top of the page, much larger than the letters in the small font in the essay, what appears to be a two-sentence title. "Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true." She claims the Declaration of Independence does not mark the beginning of a new era in human civilization, but yet another notch on the belt of white supremacy's oppressive march on American soil. In her mind, America's actual birth date was during the year 1619, when 20 to 30 African slaves landed near Jamestown. Point Comfort was the actual spot. And to that end, as was mentioned earlier, she titled her new book, The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story. Unlike the great abolitionist orator Frederick Douglass, who called the 4th of July, 1776, the first great fact of American history, and, quote, the birthday of American liberty and independence, Hannah Jones looks past the statement, all men are created equal, and focuses on its contradiction over 150 years earlier. She calls that, quote, the true foundation, end quote, of America. She never explains, however, how the spirit of '76 was even possible if color prejudice ran so deeply and thoroughly in white America's veins. She takes this and many other examples of white contributions to the freedom struggle for granted, asserting that it was, quote, black people who turned the Declaration into a freedom document, end quote. To her credit, Hannah Jones ably informs us of many important contributions that blacks have made to America's political and cultural prosperity. But unfortunately, she presents her cri de coeur under the guise of history, unabashed revisionist history, for those she believes have drunk the Kool-Aid for far too long of America's quote-unquote mythology about freedom and equality for all. While her debt to Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, and Ralph Ellison, I believe, is evident in her account of the many ways blacks have contributed to American progress, she excludes significant facts that would undermine what I believe is a disingenuous argument about the American founders and their greatest defender, Abraham Lincoln. As you might guess, I think the good part, or the good intention of her project is eclipsed by the bad and the ugly parts. Let's begin with what could have been a worthwhile contribution to our self-understanding. That's her effort to highlight how black Americans have been an intrinsic part of the American story from the beginning. I think that the good part of her essay is, as we'll see, the Ellisonian part, Ralph Ellison. Few commentators on the 1619 Project have focused on the main thread of her article, which is her wrestling with her father's patriotism. A black American who fought in the United States Army but experienced racial harassment and discrimination, he insisted on flying a pristine American flag proudly in front of their home. As she tells it, she eventually recognized that her father's steadfast devotion to the United States, despite the racial bigotry he experienced, owed to his recognition of how much his country was the product of Black American blood, sweat, toil, and tears. To betray America would be to betray the many ways his Black American ancestors helped shape America's language, our literature, our politics, and our economics. And so Hannah Jones comes to appreciate her father's patriotism because it flows from his awareness that America's redeeming qualities were, as she frames it, the product of a people forged in the crucible of American slavery and segregation. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the creator of what was known at the time as Negro History Week, what we now call African American History Month, he defined, quote, the meaning of Negro History Week as follows: not so much Negro History Week as it is a history week. We should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history, end quote. In this, it reflects, I believe, a laudable concern that Black contributions to American prosperity be included, not ignored. W.E.B. Du Bois commented on the role of Black people in the making of America in his great book of essays in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk. He said, "Your country? How came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Actively, we have woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. Our song, our toil, our tears, and warning have been given to this nation in blood brotherhood. Are not these gifts worth the giving?" That's Du Bois. To leave Black Americans out of American history is to relegate them to an inferior status, thereby promoting or reinforcing white supremacy as the norm. In the words of novelist Ralph Ellison, quote, "Minorities have the responsibility of having their ideals and images recognized as part of the composite image, which is that of the still forming American people." Black American history, or rather, Blacks in American history, is also important as it shows how Black Americans forced white Americans to take their ideals seriously. In a 1970 Time magazine article, Ralph Ellison observed that, quote, "Today it is the Black American who puts pressure upon the nation to live up to its ideals. It is he who gives creative tension to our struggle for justice." So a chief way that Blacks have shaped American history is their political activism on behalf of the ideals of the regime. Ellison thought America, quote, "could not survive being deprived their presence because they symbolize both its most stringent testing and possibility of its greatest human freedom." Aware of the failures of the early American Republic to secure the rights of all Americans immediately, Ellison still called the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights sacred documents. He thought that on the basis of those documents, Blacks kept the nation focused on what he called the extension of the democratic process in the direction of perfecting itself. Hannah Jones gives all the credit to Black Americans. "It is we," she says, "who have been the perfecters of this democracy." Now, if that is the good part of her project, bringing Black Americans into the freedom struggle from day one, where do the bad and the ugly come in? I hate to say it, but it's not hard to point out how bad her history is. Her thesis and related essays under the auspices of the 1619 Project have received serious criticism, and these can be readily found online and in print. My own written critique can be found on the American Mind website, entitled, "America Was Not Founded on White Supremacy." Historians, political scientists, and economists from across the political spectrum have weighed the 1619 Project and found it seriously wanting. For example, Hannah Jones lambasts Jefferson's fellow white colonists for establishing what she called a network of laws and customs that perpetuated slavery despite their knowing that black people were human beings. But if slavery was the driving force of American politics, why did 6 of the original 13 colonies turn states, why did 6 of them ban slavery? Why did Vermont, the 14th American state, enter the Union with an anti-slavery constitution? What about the monumental court cases in Massachusetts between 1781 and 1783, where Mum Betts, also known as Elizabeth Freeman, and Quock Walker enslaved black people? They sued for their freedom in Massachusetts shortly after Massachusetts adopted a new constitution in 1780. In that American state, enslaved black people not only had the legal right to sue, but they won. They won lawsuits on the basis of a plain reading of the Massachusetts Constitution. Do the courts of Massachusetts, relying upon a constitution whose first article of its Declaration of Rights declares, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, do these count as part of that network of laws and customs? For a nation supposedly founded on slavery, Massachusetts actually had a constitution and laws written entirely by white people that rather quickly produced not only the freedom of those black litigants, but it actually abolished the institution of slavery in the state of Massachusetts. Nicole Hannah Jones is either unaware or deliberately omits these and many other facts about early American political development that contradict her one-note account of black Americans contesting white supremacy as the driver of American politics. A good historian would not do this. A journalist with a political agenda would. Had she read the writings of slaveholders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, she would have learned that they not only acknowledged the injustice of slavery, but also discussed the obstacles to emancipation in the short run. The American founders were revolutionaries, to be sure, but prudence marked their efforts to establish national independence in light of the pre-existing institution of slavery in the 13 American states. During the Revolutionary War and the early efforts to cement a union of the American states, to make it an actual country, the founders believed they could not free themselves and their slaves at the same time. To insist on the latter as a condition of the former would have doomed both projects. For example, South Carolina and Georgia were, as the economists would put it, land rich and labor poor. And so they were hesitant, to be sure, to do anything too quickly to stem the flow of slaves into their states. To lose their support during the Revolutionary War, when only a united effort to throw off British rule promised any hope of success, would have made an already audacious enterprise much less likely to succeed. Her essay reflects a woeful ignorance of the writings of the founders. Even her chapter, I've read the expanded version of her essay in her new book, even that chapter spends almost no time at the Constitutional Convention, where they actually framed the Constitution. It reflects, her essay reflects a woeful ignorance of the writings of the founders, who consistently affirmed that all human beings possess natural rights. The slave-holding founders, yes, were all too aware that the enslaved had legitimate grievances. As Jefferson put it, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race. Jefferson admitted that, quote, deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, end quote, further complicated, obviously, any attempt to free blacks in a way that would enable them to enjoy the exercise of their natural rights. Jefferson thought that emancipation would need to be followed by what he called expatriation, or colonization, in order to induce a white population fearful, justly fearful of retribution by former slaves, to secure justice for the enslaved. Now, this was speculation on his part, but not unfounded, as the Gabriel Prosser Revolt in Virginia in 1800 and the Haitian Revolution in 1791, led by Toussaint Louverture, illustrated the potential for a race war wherever slaves outnumbered, wherever black slaves outnumbered the white population. According to the 1619 Project's lead essay, there's no debate, no struggle among the founders in their efforts to form a more perfect union. To leave out this significant element of the founding era is to leave out an important aspect of America's political development, namely that we are a nation born of debate, argument, and usually peaceful resolution. Wrestling with this reality would produce not only a more accurate account of our founding in history, but I believe one more engaging to teach our children. Their civic education will be more accurate, more lively, more constructive as they learn about the ideals and leading actors of our nation's history, as well as our failings. I could say more, but alas, her essay forces us to turn from the bad to the ugly. Her account of Abraham Lincoln. To complete her takedown of the founders, she has to take down their greatest defender. Nicole Hannah-Jones claims that Lincoln, quote, believed that free black people were a troublesome presence, incompatible with the democracy intended for white people. That's her quote. She omits that Lincoln was describing Kentucky Senator and slaveholder Henry Clay's opinion regarding the difficulty of having free blacks and enslaved blacks live in the same community. She did not correct this error in her book. In an 1852 eulogy, speaking of Clay's leadership of the American Colonization Society, Lincoln says of Clay, quote, he considered it no demerit in the society that it tended to relieve slaveholders from the troublesome presence of the free Negroes, end quote. By the 1850s, the agitation over slavery was tearing the nation apart. The prospects for peaceful, lawful abolition looked increasingly distant. Clay's efforts to encourage free blacks to establish a self-governing colony in Africa did meet with Lincoln's approval because he thought it could help lessen the growing divide in America and perhaps facilitate their eventual emancipation in all of the American states. Hannah-Jones compounds her error by omitting the context of Lincoln's direct and bracing speech to a group of local black leaders in August of 1862. When he told them to consider the prospects of colonization, he stated, "Your race suffer very greatly, many of them, by living among us, while ours suffer from your presence." He was pointing out the pervasive white prejudice that would undermine peaceful coexistence. So with a nation at war with itself and a white majority with a long-standing prejudice against black people, north and south of the Mason-Dixon line, Lincoln was trying to prepare Americans for a proclamation of emancipation in rebel-held states. The president needed to show the country that all avenues for resolving the military conflict were being pursued before he resorted to emancipation by a military proclamation. She acknowledges that Lincoln had already drafted the proclamation when he invited these leaders to the White House, but was concerned about its reception among white Americans. But then she asserts that Lincoln, quote, also opposed black equality, end quote. She was quoting a comment he made during his 1858 debates with Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. She's not a historian, understood, but she could have gotten the history right if she learned about and presented the context that is essential to understanding what and why something is said. In his first formal debate, with Lincoln, Stephen Douglas declared, "I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form." This is Stephen Douglas. "I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made by white men, for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever." That is the context for Lincoln's response. He was responding to Douglas's unabashed, categorical white supremacy in a state, Illinois, a free state, where blacks couldn't vote, they couldn't serve in the militia, they couldn't serve on juries where a white person was a defendant. Abolitionists were viewed as extremists because of their moral absolutism and their political indifference, for some outright hostility towards the Constitution and the rule of law. So Stephen Douglas did everything he could to tar Lincoln and the Republican Party with the abolition brush, whereas Lincoln did what he could to build a bridge from where a bigoted citizenry stood to where he wanted them to go. And for that, he needed their consent. Hannah Jones did quote Lincoln correctly when he said during the debates that he did that he did not favor that black Illinoisans in 1858 politically and socially should be their equals. Lincoln said, "I don't favor that" in 1858. But what she failed to appreciate was that Lincoln had to respond to Douglas's outright white supremacy in a manner that could appeal to moderate elements of a state where blacks had recently been banned from even entering Illinois. If Lincoln played the race card, Douglas played the whole deck. But I don't believe Lincoln played the race card in quite the way that she portrays. In a state where white supremacy was the norm, not the exception, what is remarkable to me is the degree to which Lincoln consistently affirmed the natural rights of black people. Why would he do that when blacks can't even vote in Illinois? Where Douglas interprets the Declaration of Independence as having no application to black people, Lincoln affirms the opposite. Here's Lincoln. "There is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I hold that he is as much entitled to these as the white man." When Hannah Jones asserts anti-black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, and she cites Lincoln's presidency as yet another example of how this played out poorly for black people in American history, she gives no credit to the president who did the most to preserve, protect, and defend, even to the point of war, the Constitution, and the kind of country that could secure the rights of racial minorities. There's no mention of Lincoln's vigorous critique of the 1857 Dred Scott opinion, where he lambasts Chief Justice Roger Taney for reading black people out of the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln laments, quote, "that all the powers of earth seem rapidly combining against black people." She never mentions the Gettysburg Address, which Lincoln delivered in the year following his Emancipation Proclamation, challenging the nation to do what? Experience a new birth of freedom, one that would now include 3 to 4 million black people as fellow citizens deserving of the protection of the government, of the people, by the people, for the people. No mention of Lincoln's second inaugural address, a speech unsurpassed in its acknowledgement that slavery was a profound wrong committed by America towards her black inhabitants, and which he claimed the Almighty may have rectified by allowing a devastating civil war and yielding an emancipation neither side expected. There's no mention of Lincoln's repeated advocacy of giving black people the vote in 1864 and 1865, when only 6 states in the entire United States allowed black people to vote. The first time a president ever said that. Of course, there's no mention that Lincoln was assassinated because of these efforts, and for which Frederick Douglass called him the first martyr president of the United States. But for Lincoln, whose words and deeds remain the gold standard for American oratory and policy, the United States would have quickly veered from the country that the founders set into motion. What Hannah Jones describes as racist ideology that Jefferson and the framers had used at the nation's founding, Lincoln calls these the very definitions and axioms of a free society. Lincoln understood the predicament of the founders, men who strove to establish a free society on the principles of equality, individual rights, consent, while also wrestling with how to wean themselves off of the entrenched practice of racial slavery. In his seventh and final debate with Stephen Douglas, Lincoln said, "We had slaves among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. Having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties." Stephen Douglas countered by preaching what he called popular sovereignty, which basically meant that white Northerners should not care if the enslavement of black people spread into the federal territories, all in the name of our revolutionary fathers. You actually have a debate between Lincoln and Douglas as to how we ought to interpret the American founding. That Hannah Jones ignores Lincoln's efforts on behalf of black Americans muddles her attempt to view American history through the lens of black patriotism. Throughout American history, black Americans have not only needed the ideals and institutions, and also the people, which includes the vast white majority of the United States. They needed all of those things in order to ensure progress in protecting civil and political rights. Now, I know Nicole Hannah Jones now claims that she didn't really mean that the nation was founded in 1619. She was just trying to reframe how Americans think about their past, how they remember their history. As she put it, quote, "The fight here is about who gets to control the national narrative, and therefore the nation's shared memory of itself," end quote. But I think her narrative is so flawed that to remember our past the way she wants us to remember it distorts what actually happened historically. It undermines the civic trust that Americans of all races and ethnicities need to have in each other in order for our diversity to strengthen rather than to divide us. Her approach is untrue to the actual history because it leaves out so much of the history, the facts, as she likes to say. It undermines a due affection for the United States precisely by making this country unlovable. And it subverts the trust between citizens of different races in its Manichaean portrayal of American progress. To include the contribution of white Americans of goodwill, is not an indulgence, but I believe a necessary part of the American story. Being honest about the multiracial American story that is what I consider to be the long civil rights struggle, the long civil rights movement of American history, not only is true to the facts, but I believe would also promote the civic health of the body politic. What better way to engender goodwill, trust, and friendship among citizens of diverse races, diversity of all kinds? What better way than teaching American children a truly capacious, truly comprehensive, truly inclusive history of their country's political birth and development? For example, she takes for granted the efforts of white Americans of goodwill, Americans who understood that the country was not founded on slavery, but on equality, human equality. And therefore, they too worked to get our practice to align more closely with our profession. Their contribution to promoting the civil and political rights of black Americans can be seen where? The landmark 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The unanimous school desegregation decision in Brown v. Board of Education of 1954, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, without significant white majorities who joined Black Americans in employing America's systemic justice, none of these pivotal constitutional and political events would have occurred. These historical facts were not lost on Joseph H. Jackson, the president of the National Baptist Convention, the largest denomination of Black Christians in the United States. Jackson said, "As a minority group, we cannot win outside of the protection and power of the just laws of this land. Read history with open eyes and attentive minds. We will discover no minority group has and can win in a struggle by the direct confrontation of the majority and by employing the same types of pressures and powers that the majority possess in abundance. The hope of the minority struggle is with the just laws of the land and the moral and constructive forces that are germane to this nation's life and character." His rival, Martin Luther King Jr., also recognized that the key to progress was to use the levers of freedom in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. "All we ask," King said, "is that you be true to what you said on paper." His dream, as you all know, was a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. These men, these Black men, these Black Americans, did not see America as a slaveocracy, which is how Nicole Hannah-Jones describes our founding. Despite her claim that, for the most part, Black Americans fought back alone, they simply could not have done this without the help of a whole lot of white Americans. That's the history, the real history. Perhaps channeling the muse of Ralph Ellison, she writes that to this day, Black Americans, more than any other group, embrace the democratic ideals of a common good. I believe that this will continue to hold true only if Black Americans continue to learn that the American founding was good, even exceptional, which she denies in both its principles and structures. In his first inaugural address, President Bill Clinton summed up the genius of our self-governing way of life. He said, "There's nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America." If Americans of all races learn that the spirit of '76 reflects the better angel of our political nature and is not some demon to be exorcised, then Americans can reclaim their common political heritage. Only then can diverse Americans live out their national motto, e pluribus unum, and have a reasonable hope for unity, even as they debate the means by which they seek to promote the common good. But if Americans lack a conviction about the essential goodness of the United States, not only its ideals as laid out in the Declaration of Independence, but its structures as spelled out in the Constitution, our civic habits like the rule of law, and most importantly, the goodness, the moral goodness of a diverse American people, a goodness that Hannah-Jones makes more difficult to see and understand, our political polarization can only get worse. In the end, Nicole Hannah-Jones' lead essay and now chapter for the 1619 Project, I believe, is a missed opportunity to help us understand our past better and therefore enable us to see and trust one another as fellow citizens of a common country. The short shrift she pays to the goodwill of so many white citizens who supported the Black freedom struggle, I believe, can only sap the trust that is necessary for racial diversity to strengthen rather than to weaken our national union. Thank you. I will now evade questions. I like to call it a student first, but not to put too much pressure. So I won't look over on that side, but you know who you are.
Alternative
So you mean, I'll repeat did everyone, do you want to repeat the question? I'll see if I can, it was a long question. Do I see a parallel issue or set of issues that is analogous to the struggle that we're having in terms of looking at the role that race, racial slavery, racial segregation, I'm adding that, what the role that race has played, the pernicious role that race has played in American history, do I see an analogous issue or point of contention that we're also wrestling with today and trying to figure out what's the proper context to understand these sorts of things? I don't think of anything that is one that's as obtrusive, as in our face as the question of race. I mean, when I called her essay in 1619, the August 2019 essay on 1619, a cultural phenomenon. I think it was the cultural phenomenon in that year. I put it on my syllabus that fall. I put it on the following semester. I've taught it every semester since. You have to teach stuff. You know, I teach political philosophy, so I've got a lot of things that I teach that I don't believe in, but I think are important for students to understand. Guess what's being added to the syllabus next semester? Next semester, I teach a course every year on race and equality. It's basically greatest hits of Black American political and social thought. I emphatically think that we have to learn more about critical race theory. And so I'm going to find the leading proponents, you know, Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, these guys. I'm gonna add them to the syllabus because it is playing such, in my opinion, such an outsized role in how we're trying to relate to one another. I live in Virginia. We had an election earlier this year. That was had surprising outcome. This is all my way of stalling, because I can't think of anything that comes close to our struggle right now over race. We're dealing with issues of sex, right? How do we understand gender? Is gender a natural thing, or is it something that you really can just devise and you know, self-identify? I think that's an issue that's pressing, but I don't think anything. I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones, mission accomplished, right? She had an entire magazine of the leading newspaper, you know, people call it the official paper of record, New York Times. She had an entire magazine devoted to the question of how much racial slavery and segregation has infected pretty much every aspect of American life. And now we can't but see that everywhere we look, whether it's there or not, right? Today we talk more about equity than we talk about equality. That is to say, whenever we see differences in outcome, now the default position is not, well, there could be individual reasons why these outcomes are different. Now the default position has become what? If there are differences, what must be the cause? Not any particular individual, but a structure, a system, okay? So whether we like it or not, that's how we think things. We think about things, the lens of race. I can't think of anything that is as powerful in shaping how we're thinking and what we're wrestling with to try to figure out how to do justice in this country. And this is far from over in terms of us as a nation trying to figure it out. Frederick Douglass, I do a lot of work with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass says, until Black people get justice in this country, race will be a problem. And the fact that race is still a problem in 2021, almost 2022, at minimum, I think we have to admit that somehow or another, we haven't secured justice for all people in this country, regardless of race. So the devil's in the details. Right? The question is, well, how do we achieve justice? Do we do it through what some people call a colorblind constitution? Or do we do it in a way that recognizes or understands our constitution and laws and ways of life even are systemically white supremacist? Those are two very different options. And if I can add my own little editorial, I paid for this microphone, haha. Only a few of you know who actually said that before I did. This whole debate over equality and equity, I don't think that we'll be able to settle that one until we figure out a common way of even talking about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a human being, and therefore what you are owed by your government. We had a civil war, not because there were bad people and good people who started shooting at each other. Aristotle teaches us that civil wars come from two groups of people who have two different conceptions of justice. That's what the Civil War was about. Justice in the South meant something a whole lot to do with what they deserved as slaveholders. We deserve to take our property, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, our slaves, to federal territories. That's what we're owed under our Constitution. And ironically enough, guess what? You're discriminating against us if you don't let us white people take black people as slaves into federal territories. Northerners, a good number of other Americans disagreed with that opinion of what the Constitution owed. So that's just an example. So this difference of opinion about justice, this difference of opinion about what we're owed under our common government, I think, and this is why I study Lincoln, I don't think we're going to resolve that difference of opinion, and it's a fundamental one. I don't think we can resolve it until we start speaking the same language. And for me, I find that language, and Nicole Hannah-Jones finds this language where? In the Declaration of Independence. The difference between us is she doesn't think they meant it, and I think they did. But short answer is, no, I can't think of another one. Please.
You mentioned how Hannah Jones's project is like a heightened version of political polarization, and she does that through a very much a presentism lens. How do we, as like self-made historians, per se, avoid that presentism lens from your perspective?
The question is, how is it that, well, the question was, you're saying that Nicole Hannah-Jones has furthered our polarization because she has looked at the issue of how race and white supremacy, to be more specific, has infected America throughout its centuries. She looks at it through a presentism or a present lens. Yeah, I think she would probably disagree with being, with describing it that way, so I want to be fair to her. I think her claim is, look, there were people as early as 1619 who knew what was being done to those, most likely Angolans, who were dragged off that ship at Point Comfort, Virginia. There were people that were alive then that knew what they were doing was wrong. So I think she would claim that the injustice of racial slavery, of any kind of slavery, was not the product of, you know, our great modern or postmodern minds. She would say, no, good grief, there's plenty of abolitionists that you could find. Well, maybe not plenty, but there were abolitionists back then just as they were now. Injustice was just as obvious back then as it is now. My claim is, yeah, I agree. Washington agrees, Madison agrees, Jefferson agrees, slaveholders, every single one of them. You will find nothing in their writings that ever say that what they are doing in practice to black people, enslaving them on their estates, is just in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the natural law, or what the Declaration calls the laws of nature and of nature's God. They knew precisely what they were doing was immoral and wrong. Okay, Washington referred to it as, you know, this arbitrary sway that we have over, I think he called them our blacks. The thing she doesn't want to struggle with is, well, how do you get people who admit that the thing they are doing contradicts this other thing they're trying to do, right, which is to establish a country based on equality. Not white supremacy, but human equality. What she doesn't want to wrestle with is, why did they struggle? Right? She makes it too easy for herself, and she actually makes the argument of Chief Justice Taney, of all people, which she tries to equate with Lincoln, which is crazy. Lincoln condemned the Taney opinion in Dred Scott, but in her essay, Taney is the pivot from racist Jefferson to racist Lincoln. That's Taney's purpose. That one paragraph, that's its sole purpose, is to show you that I'm just connecting the dots. Racist, racist, racist. White supremacy in our DNA. Lincoln's no better. Equating Lord Dunmore's proclamation with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation? Are you kidding? Right? At any rate, she doesn't want to wrestle with what they believed, and this is a debatable point. Let's do this. This is history. This is political science. She doesn't want to wrestle with what they saw as impediments, obstacles to doing all the right things immediately. Do you know what politicians call this? Wrestling with this in practice with a population that is fallible, imperfect, sinful, not entirely high-minded every waking moment of their lives, to take into account the prejudices that people already have and to try to get them to move from those prejudices to at least a slightly better, maybe a much better place. It's called statesmanship. We don't talk about that today. There's a lot of reasons why. We don't see too many around. As my great teacher Harry Jaffa once said, the mark of statesmanship, short definition is political prudence. The mark of statesmanship is seeking to cultivate the greatest extent of consent that you can for the justice that they will support. Massive difference between a Stephen Douglas as President of the United States and remember, this is a free white northerner, at least overtly not in favor of slavery. He becomes president, the United States nationalizes slavery. Do you know what his 13th and 14th Amendments were? Lincoln's elected November 1860. You get this for free. Lincoln's elected November 1860. Stephen Douglas knew as early as October he was going to lose, Bell was going to lose, Breckinridge was going to lose. Abraham Lincoln, abolitionist, Republican, Abraham Lincoln was going to become president of the United States. The country's going to tear itself apart. How do you prevent secession? Made speeches all over the upper South. They told him where to go. Christmas Eve, he proposes what would have been our 13th and 14th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, so famously today known as what? Due process, privileges or immunities, and the all-important Equal Protection Clause. His 14th Amendment's first sentence said, in so many words, black people or mulattoes, make sure we don't leave anybody out, one-drop rule, black people cannot vote in any election anywhere on American soil, federal, state, municipal, territorial, nor can they serve in any political office at any level. Did I mention Stephen Douglas was from the free state of Illinois? Not a slaveholder, at least technically, we could get into that, but not a slaveholder. That was the alternative. Stephen Douglas was the leading Democrat of the 1850s. You know what that made him? The most important politician in the United States for 10 years running. A leading candidate for the Democratic nomination in 1856, we would have ended up with him and not James Buchanan. Thankfully, there was sufficient political will in the United States not to adopt those amendments. So I'm saying we take so much for granted when we look at what we consider to be the failings of the founders, or in my case, in the failings of Lincoln, that we don't understand that politics isn't the alternative of horrible and perfect, right? It's getting the greatest good that you can get a majority consent behind. And Lincoln was doing everything he can. Get this, why isn't Lincoln in favor of black people voting in Illinois in 1858? If he can't even get white people in the free state of Illinois, which is competing with Indiana to see who was more white supremacist, if Lincoln can't get white people in a free state to shore up their conviction that black people have the same natural rights as they do, for Lincoln to campaign for perfect social, political, and civil equality is a non-starter politically. Right? That might sound good in an editorial. It doesn't get you elected. So the question is, what is Lincoln doing vis-a-vis the existing bigotry that he finds among his neighbors and in a state where there's maybe 5,000 or 6,000 black people in the entire state and they can't vote? Why is Lincoln standing up for black people in that election? He thinks, if I can't get white Northerners
to care if people who don't look like them are enslaved in federal territories, the next thing will be the nationalization of slavery, right? You don't have to own a slave if you're a white person, but you shouldn't be able to tell your neighbor not to. That's where we were going. And Lincoln called Douglas's politics, this was his word, invidious. Why invidious? Invidious because he says, you know what? Where he's ending up, Stephen Douglas, is the same place Jefferson Davis wanted us to go. The difference was with Jefferson Davis, he told you straight up, I think slavery should be legal everywhere. Whereas with Stephen Douglas, it's like, oh, just don't care. Be indifferent about it. And Lincoln said that indifference means slavery is going to spread in this country without anybody having to make an argument for it. That is the political reality on the ground. And in my mind, it is the height of statesmanship that Lincoln recognized what he could get, or at least attempt to, get political support for, to get people at least moving in the right direction. And to the extent that that happened over time, and it wasn't just Lincoln, abolitionists were involved as well. What's his name? William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolitionist of the day, was actually brought on as an honoree when Fort Sumter came back into Union hands, and they raised the flag there. They made sure William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist, and Lincoln was not an abolitionist, they made sure William Lloyd Garrison was there. That was the administration's way of saying, yeah, it's not just us, it's not just Lincoln, it's even those fanatics about morality and racial equality. They had something to do with cultivating this opinion. But very few abolitionists got elected to office. Lincoln, I believe, demonstrated his statesmanship by trying to figure out how to get, if you will, a moral majority behind doing the right thing. If we can't do everything, is it wrong to shoot for some things, some measure of justice, rather than simply, performing some moral grandstanding? All right. Sorry, it took long with that. You guys want to arm wrestle? Okay, we'll get back to you. Please.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the New York Times. It's an important newspaper, obviously the most important in this country, maybe in the world.
Some people say, yeah.
And you've been thinking about it a lot because of this project. And you had a comment earlier on about what a journalist would do and what a historian would do. And so I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts about that important newspaper and maybe the way it's changed in recent years.
It's clear that Jake Silverstein doubled down on the 1619 Project when they received this letter from prominent historians. Now, to say historians makes it sound like they all agree, right? No, there are a number of historians, and she quotes a couple of them in the chapter of the book that she calls Democracy, which is an expansion of her essay. Not all the historians disagreed with the 1619 Project or her essay for that matter. And as I say, she quotes two of them. But when they received this letter from historians, and we aren't being serious. We're being disingenuous if we say, oh, Nicole Hannah-Jones produced this great piece about the effect of racial slavery and segregation on America, and she just got, lambasted by these right-wingers. Sorry. Sean Wilentz at Princeton is no right-winger. Right? Gordon Wood is not a right-winger. The Northwestern historian Leslie Harris, who actually wrote an article in Politico saying, look, I was one of the fact checkers on 1619, and I told them, look, when you say that a major argument or reason for the Declaration of Independence was to preserve slavery, I study this area. That's not true. They said, no, thank you. She's not a right-winger. So for us to say, oh, it's left-wing versus right-wing, you're not serious. I can't take you serious if you're trying to play that game, okay? When the New York Times got that letter, they doubled down. The only thing they walked back was, oh, okay, Nicole Hannah-Jones admits she knows that the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. She knows the country was basically founded during the Revolutionary War. She didn't really mean to say we were founded in 1619 when 20 to 30 Angolans were pulled off that ship at Point Comfort near Jamestown, Virginia. The only thing they walked back was the using the word founding. You heard it in the intro and you heard it in my speech. What did she call the book? 1619 Project. A new what? Origin story. What's origin a synonym of? Founding. So all they did was back off the nomenclature. Everything else they doubled down on. Didn't correct the Lincoln, the manifest incorrect quotation, misquotation of Lincoln. Didn't correct a number of other things that were pointed out. So the long and short of it is, it's not just Silverstein at the New York Times. It seems to be the case that journalism today, as it is being practiced, has made a concerted turn towards advocacy. In the olden days, and believe me, I try not to be nostalgic about this. I'm not a historian of newspapers in America, but because look, there have been party newspapers from the beginning, from the founding, right? So newspapers have always taken sides. But at least in the olden days, there seemed to be a fairly clear separation of what you put on the front page and what you put on the editorial page. Those strike me as becoming more and more conflated. And even newspapers today are now, it's just yet another major institution of cultural formation in the United States that now people have, more people disapprove than approve of the job they're doing. So I don't want to paint this to the New York Times. I mean, how many of you subscribe to the New York Times? And you guys don't reflect average Americans. I think you guys are above average, right? We're like Lake Wobegon. We're all are above average. Anyway, even fewer people know that reference. Fair enough. I don't think we can just blame the New York Times. The problem is, once the New York Times said, this is how we should think about the founding, right? Once they said that, this is how you should think about Jefferson, this is how you should think about Lincoln, right? And worse, this is how you should think about whites historically in this country. That's the worst thing. For me, civically, that is poisonous, okay? So the problem we face here is now even newspapers, right? The thing you don't agree with, all you have to do is say 2 words now. What are those 2 words? Fake news, right? You don't have to make an argument, you just call it fake news. You know, what's fake news? News I disagree with. But unfortunately, journalists haven't helped themselves because they've been irresponsible with facts. So I don't want to make this a New York Times thing, even though I keep repeating their name. I think this is a problem within journalism. And I think at the end of the day, that was, for me, the problem with Nicole Hannah-Jones, since you asked about her getting tenure, prospectively getting tenure at UNC, which she rejected ultimately, when they ultimately decided to award it to her if she accepted. Well, the problem there wasn't politics. The problem there wasn't partisanship. The problem there was professionalism. She made it very clear when this essay was published that, and I'm almost quoting her verbatim, she said, "You cannot read that magazine cover to cover and not conclude that something is owed to black people in this country." That's almost a verbatim quote. You cannot read that magazine cover to cover. It's not just her essay, it's all the other essays. You cannot read this cover to cover and not believe and not conclude that something is owed to black Americans. She's made it clear that her purpose was one word: reparations. Now, reparations, we should debate it. No doubt, we should debate that. But she had a particular agenda, and so she assembled facts. I'll be generous. She assembled facts to promote that particular agenda. So that's fine. But don't say you're only interested in the facts. Don't say that you're trying to produce a better history. She quickly backed off. She keeps saying, oh, it's not a history, it's not a history. She had to say that because historians were telling her she was wrong, okay? So all our institutions apparently need some serious rehabilitation these days, and journalists are now in that line as well. That's the best thing I can do for you.
Well, you just partly answered my question, which was going to be...
Was it a good answer?
Well, you earlier stated that you interpreted the project as having a political agenda, so I
It's her words.
About what you thought that agenda was. But the other thing I was going to invite is you focused a lot on that essay. What about the other essays that were part of the 1690?
Yeah, as you might imagine, and it's been 2+ years, I've given more than one speech about this essay. She's probably going, man, you're making a lot of money off me. Believe me, I wish I was making Nicole Hannah-Jones money. I wish. Okay, anyway. There were 18 essays, okay? I'm a political scientist, and when she stepped on my toes is when she talked about the founders, and especially Lincoln. So I'm like, okay, people are gonna ask me about this, I need to know about this, and I knew that it was gonna have an impact culturally, the way that it did. And so I only focused on the ones that affected my day job, okay? So an essay that talks about the founding in Lincoln, you're on my turf now. And then the essay by Jamel Bowie, who's another journalist. Most of the essays were not written by historians. That's another problem. I'll leave that to others to point out, but that was another major problem with it. Jamel Bowie writes an essay that attempts to link modern day populism, Trumpism, and explicitly the Republican Party to the original proponents of the positive good theory of slavery, John C. Calhoun, South Carolina senator. Nowhere in that essay does he mention the Democratic Party, John Calhoun, Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy, the seceding states, massive resistance in my Commonwealth of Virginia. All of that was the product. I'm trying not to make this a partisan thing. I'm telling you, this is a journalist who, when he thought of mentioning political parties in his essay, seemed to only look at one party as if it was the grand evil, and neglecting to remind people all along the way in history, these whites only, these lily white primaries in Texas and the rest of the former rebel states, were any of those Republican states? No. They were Democratic strongholds. Why does he leave out the fact that John C. Calhoun was a leading Democrat, the leading Democrat in antebellum America? That's a question that answers itself, right? So those are the two essays. I wrote a backgrounder for the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in DC. They wanted to know, well, what's the 1690 Project going to do with the curriculum and all that sort of stuff. So I looked at those two essays, because those are my fields of expertise. I looked at Nicole Hannah-Jones and Jamel Bowie, and I said, wow, they're going to introduce these into high schools. How are they going to use them? Are they going to say at the beginning, by the way, these aren't historians, by the way, there's no footnotes, by the way, at the time, no footnotes, now they're in the book. By the way, these are journalists. These are editorials, long-form editorials. If you do that, guess what you should also include? How about editorials that push back on that narrative? How about a counter argument? Do you think that's how the 1619 Project essay is going to be used? No. It'll be taken as the latest facts, interpretation, account about how we should understand our history. I think you need to make it a fair fight. I don't think you need to present it as gospel. And so the problem for me, in terms of employing that in the curriculum, especially Jamel Bowie's essay, that's just propaganda. Okay, I don't need, I'm a product of the public schools. Then I went to private schools for college, but I'm K through 12, public schools, Southern California, tell by my accent. That, for me to read a Nicole Hannah-Jones essay, say my senior year in history, I don't mind that. If the next day the professor assigns what? My essay, America was not founded on white supremacy. Or something, right? I mean, make it a fair fight. That for me is education. You present one side of it. Who was it? Was it, oh good grief, I'm forgetting. Was it Rousseau? Who said that when you only know your side of the argument, you probably don't even know that side very well. Is that how we want to teach our kids? Make it a fair fight.
So that was the part two of my question was going to be, there has been a response from the Trump administration.
1776. And I know some of those guys. You want my thoughts on it?
Yeah, just whether, so is that the right answer, or is that just one of these ones that are...
Well, I mean, they now have a curriculum that derives from that report. This was a tough one for me because I know those guys. I know the guys who wrote it. I know a few of the historians who were there when Trump announced it. I would say they're trying to shore up the things that they still believe are true about the good things about our past, the good things about our founding, both in principle and in structure and in ways of life. But I wouldn't say, oh, replace, the Pulitzer Center's, curriculum ideas. And by the way, the Pulitzer Center for Journalism is separate than the Pulitzer Prize Committee that awards the prizes each year. Those are two different entities. They're not the same. But the one that is driving curriculum based on the 1619 Project, I don't think you can just simply replace one perspective with another perspective. I'm in favor of making it a fair fight. So for example, these state laws to ban, the teaching of critical race theory in colleges? Really? I teach the Communist Manifesto. I teach Machiavelli's The Prince. I mean, what's going to happen to me? I used to teach Nietzsche, right? I mean, the point is, are we interested in education or are we interested in indoctrination? I thought you looked like you were about to ask me a question. Or you just needed to breathe. You've been sitting there with a mask this whole time.
I do need to breathe. And you've got the wheels turning, which is good. That's the point, right, of you being here in this discussion.
I hope that some of them stop.
It's great. It's great. But I just, you pointed out yourself that, these are essays. They're not scholarly articles, right? It was published in a scholarly journal. So,
right.
For me, in part, the point of bringing to light something that hasn't been brought to light before and shifting the conversation and the cultural phenomenon and shifting the paradigm, for me, I see it as like a pendulum, right? We've been on this side of the pendulum for a long time with history in our conversation, and now the pendulum has swung here. Then we got to come back to center, like you're saying, right? I love that you're fact-checking. I love that you're holding people accountable, but, I don't think the point of the essays was necessarily to develop a curriculum and teach us history. It was to get us thinking and shift the conversation, right? And the way that, I'm a student and a fan of Howard Zinn. Lots of footnotes, lots of research, a true historian that blew my mind when I first read him. But he didn't, do what she did with the 1619 Project. It didn't.
What do you mean he didn't do it?
Well, he did. Maybe I'm wrong, but it didn't seem to become like this national conversation.
I disagree.
Well, okay.
Do you want my short answer? No Howard Zinn, no Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Yeah.
Nicole Hannah-Jones, when she is asked what has been her inspiration, her motivation, and she's mentioned this several times, was not Howard Zinn, it was Lerone Bennett, Before the Mayflower. It was a book that was written about African Americans in American history that blew her mind. I think she read it when she was a junior in high school or something like that. And she had not read anything about blacks in American history up until then, except for what? We were enslaved and we were victims of segregation. Ooh, who wants to study that? And Lerone Bennett opened up this whole series of things that happened in our past that she said, why isn't this in any of the books that I've read up till now, okay? So she will say that her inspiration had been Lerone Bennett, and I have serious problems with Lerone Bennett because he wrote a biography of, well, it's not really a biography, it was a critique, a 600-page critique of Abraham Lincoln called Forced into Glory. And in one of my book reviews, I said, the only way to get Lincoln more wrong, let's go with wronger. The only way to get Lincoln wronger is to misspell his name. It was that bad a book. So that's my opinion of Lerone Bennett. But what I am saying is, you're saying that Zinn has not had the effect. If you ask, are you a high school teacher? Okay, close. I work with middle school and high school teachers. I do workshops almost every month for Gilder Lehrman, Liberty Fund, Ashbrook Center. I've done these for almost as long as I've been a college professor, and I've been a college professor for almost 30 years. in working with middle school and high school teachers, and mostly high school teachers that I work with, they know Zinn by heart. Zinn has, I think, profoundly shaped the way history is taught, U.S. history is taught in the public schools in the United States. And what the success of that is precisely that what? Nobody knows his name, but they know his ideas, right? And those ideas have shaped the way they think about our past. So I would disagree. I think that Zinn actually has influenced and shaped the way American history is taught in this country. Nicole Hannah-Jones is having her day in the sun right now, and because, as I say, I'm worried about the civic impact, and by that I mean how it's shaping how we understand ourselves as citizens and how we are either being equipped or debilitated in our attempts to talk to each other across the aisle. We just had Thanksgiving, didn't we? Right? Those fun family conversations where you don't bring up certain names or topics. I do think that her project could have done way more good to shape how we understand ourselves and be honest about our history. And because she didn't do history rigorously, and I don't know, I didn't redo the research. I don't know the research she did, but how to put this? If you're going to say new things, or what you think are new things about Jefferson or Lincoln, these are well-tilled fields. So if you're going to say something different, as they say in the streets, you better come correct. You better come correct. Yeah. So, I mean, again, in her case, I mean, she hasn't gotten a reparations bill passed. That's what she wants. She says two things need to happen on reparations. And I say, these are debatable things. Totally fair to debate these, right? Two things need to happen on reparations. Cash money to black people. That won't even come close to what they're owed. But this is a moral recognition that this country has to have. So she would say, they deserve a check, A, and B, more money to underserved communities. That's her goal. That's her goal. That if you wanted her to define reparations, those two things. Okay? Let's debate those, for sure. Yes?
I want to piggyback a little bit off the previous two questions. Other than 400 years is a nice, satisfying round number, do you think that the impetus for the 1619 project is a response to maybe a more nationalistic narrative of American history, or maybe it's equally or even more inaccurate?
Well, I'm going to give you her account of how she came to even bring this idea up. You know, she's a journalist. She's a reporter, investigative reporter for the New York Times. She was a MacArthur, what we call Genius Grant recipient several years ago. So she was already acknowledged as a top flight journalist, right? I haven't, I'm going to count on my fingers how many times I've won the MacArthur Genius. 0. That's a serious recognition in her field as a journalist. She said every week at the New York Times, we have these pitch meetings where we throw ideas about stuff to do. And she said, this is 2019, and we're coming up on the 400th anniversary of when these 20 to 30 African slaves were pulled off those ships at Point Comfort. Why don't we talk about that? I've got some ideas that I think, that slavery really has had a much more profound impact on almost anything you look or touch today. Our consumption of sugar, traffic patterns in Atlanta, et cetera. And Silverstein and the rest tossed it around and said, go for it, it's your baby. They didn't give her an article, they gave her the whole magazine, okay? That was the genesis. She said, with editorials, the hook is always the question, right? Why now? Why an opinion piece on this now? And she had enough lead time to think, if we can get this out by August, that'll hit that round number of 400. So that's what I read. That was the genesis of this. But I guess my point about the MacArthur Genius Grant, she was recognized as an investigative journalist, and her issues have been race, race in schooling, among other things. And so that was her neck of the woods. And so she said, I think race is more pervasive. The white supremacy has been more pervasive in our history, and I think it deserves a whole issue to it. Let me catch the student first. What on the margin?
So pulling on the margin, like in terms of activism, the importance of changing like the central conception of justice in terms of activism. How do you think that as you call it, like movements like 1619 versus other activism movements who are addressing these issues in our American conception of justice? How do you think that you've talked a lot about how this project specifically is hurt and how it could have helped better?
Right. How do other movements relate to it?
Like helping and hurting, like how other activists have helped or hurt.
She's asking, how has other forms of activism, this is activism towards, roughly stated, a more racially equitable country or world to live in, how have other activists movements shaped or pushed our understanding of justice or whatever? I would hit, before this one, and of course the George Floyd. I mean, it's hard to describe what happened there. Some people clearly think it was an act of murder. I mean, willful intent. Others have a difference of opinion. But with George Floyd, I mean, that was like Emmett Till in the 1950s, when people in the United States saw an open casket of that Chicago boy who got lynched down in Mississippi, visiting relatives there. They were like, oh my goodness, I thought they were backwards in the South, but my God, that is evil. And she insisted on an open casket. Seeing that photograph, that was around the time of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Improvement Association and King's leadership, the bus boycott. I mean, that was a cultural shift in this country. I think we experienced the same thing in the throes of George Floyd. But Black Lives Matter anticipated that as well, the movement for Black Lives. Before that, we had the protests in the park on Wall Street, the 1% thing. That made a little noise and then kind of faded. So instead of race, there you have class, right? The 1% who dominate our affairs. That one didn't seem, I think, to catch nowhere near the way that BLM and especially the 1619 project did. So I don't really see the nation really shifting much in terms of activism in the way that her project and just putting race on the front burner has. Who else? Oh, sorry.
Jones is a journalist.
Yes.
He has probably reached more people than any professional historian has in the last 10 years.
Agreed.
Do you think it's something about journalism that helps them, I don't know, shape history in a way? I mean, it's somewhat discouraging being a historian.
What is it about journalism that has this more pervasive impact or effect? Well, I mean, look, let's think about this. Before Nicole Hannah-Jones, what journalist was shaping American minds? I mean, was anybody even remotely, in her stratosphere? So I don't think we can just say it's journalists, because if it was, then good grief, our lives would be changed every day of the week. That moment happened at a particular time with a particular backdrop: George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, race, right? She found a way to crystallize that in the most influential newspaper in the United States. How many journalists can say that? Not many. So I don't think it's just journalism per se, although they've got a much wider audience than the typical historian does. But you know, good history books sell. You know, we know who David McCulloch is, we know who Stephen Ambrose was, these sorts of things, these sorts of folks. So I think historians can still have that kind of impact, especially if you can get Ken Burns to do a documentary on things that you're studying. But no, I think you'd have to be, I mean, she should pat herself on the back in terms of what she accomplished. I'm not glad that she accomplished it the way that she did, but I don't, we can't take away from the fact that she pulled off something that more seasoned journalists who have a whole bunch of awards, and she's got a bunch of awards as well, even before the Pulitzer. She pulled it off. I mean, can you think of a journalist in the past 20 years who had the impact that she did? So for me, journalism has this natural audience, but journalists talk every day, and none of them have had the impact that she has. We're done? All right. Thanks for coming out. Cold night. Yay.